The cell was colder than she had ever imagined. The stone walls sweated with damp, and the single-barred window let in nothing but the sound of a lonely wind whistling across the empty street outside. The lantern hanging from a nail sputtered weakly, throwing shadows that stretched and trembled like dark fingers trying to grab hold of her. She sat on the rough wooden bench, her wrists bruised from the iron shackles, her dark hair tangled and falling across her face. Every breath she drew came with the heavy reminder that this was her last night alive. The town had already judged her, though no jury had been called. No trial was offered. Not really. They said she had killed a rancher in cold blood and stolen from his strongbox. They ignored her pleas, her cries of innocence. The sheriff's hard eyes had not wavered when he told her sentence. At dawn you hang. It was spoken as though she were no more than a stray dog caught stealing scraps. Her hands shook as she folded them together. She tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. She was not ready to meet her maker, not ready to let her story end here. Nameless and condemned in a town that would forget her as soon as the rope tightened. From outside her cell, she could hear the murmur of voices. The deputies played cards in the front office, laughing too loud, their boots scraping across the floorboards. From time to time, one of them spat tobacco juice into a tin, the sound sharp and ugly in the silence. They spoke of her like she was already gone, discussing who might take her meager belongings, how long the crowd might gather to watch the hanging, even what color dress she wore when they dragged her into town. Each word stung her ears, but beneath their voices, another sound lingered, the hush of the town itself. Beyond the walls of the jail, everything was too quiet. The saloon, usually alive with drunken songs, was still. Even the coyotes, always, howling somewhere in the distance, had gone silent. It was as if the land itself knew something dark and heavy was waiting just beyond the horizon. She closed her eyes, trying to block it all out, but memories surged instead. She saw her father's farm, the wide fields golden under the sun. She heard her mother's voice, humming old lullabies, and she saw herself as a girl, running barefoot through tall grass with laughter chasing her steps. How had her life come to this? How had it twisted so cruelly that now she sat awaiting the noose? The iron bars clanged as the sheriff himself walked back to her cell. His spurs clicked with each step. He was a tall, hard man with a square jaw and a reputation for never bending the law. He held a key in one hand and a Bible in the other. "Best make your peace," he said, his tone flat as a desert stone. "The preacher will come at sunup. You got until then." She met his gaze, her voice raw. "I didn't do it, Sheriff. You know I didn't." His eyes flickered, just once, with something she couldn't read. Doubt, perhaps, or pity. But then they hardened again. "Doesn't matter what I know. Town wants justice. You're it." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her in darkness again. The clatter of his boots faded, and once more the silence wrapped around her like a shroud. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She wanted to scream, to pound the walls until her hands bled, but instead she pressed her forehead against the cold bars and whispered into the night. "If there's anyone out there listening, anyone at all, don't let me die tomorrow." And in that moment, though she did not know it yet, the ground far beyond the town trembled with the steady thunder of approaching hooves. A shadow moved across the land, a figure feared and whispered about in every saloon and campfire tale. Fate had not forgotten her, but in her cell, alone and shaking, she could not yet feel it. For her, the world still ended at dawn. The night grew heavier as the hours crept toward dawn. The jailhouse lantern sputtered out, leaving the deputies to light their own lamps. The air smelled of old tobacco and sweat, but beneath it all was the faint scent of fear. It wasn't the prisoner in the back cell who made the men uneasy. It was the rumor that had started earlier that evening, carried in on a drifter's tongue and spreading like wildfire through the town. The most feared name in the West had been spoken aloud, Colt McKenna. Men called him many things: the Devil's Hand, the Widowmaker, the Shadow Rider. To some, he was nothing more than a merciless outlaw, a man who had gunned down more men than anyone could count. To others, he was a living legend, a figure both hated and admired, feared yet respected. One truth could not be denied. Wherever he rode, the law bent or broke. Now the rumor said he was coming here. Deputy Harlan leaned back in his chair, shuffling his cards, but his hands trembled just enough to betray him. "It ain't true," he muttered. "Can't be. Ain't no reason a man like McKenna would come to this dust pit of a town." Across the table, Deputy Briggs spat into the tin, the sound sharp in the silence. "Reason don't matter. Folks say they seen him 2 towns over. Black horse, black hat, guns strapped low. If he's heading this way, you best believe it. The cow." Sheriff, sitting in the corner with his boots propped on the desk, didn't answer right away. His eyes were narrowed, watching the smoke curl from the lamp wick. Finally, he said, "Ain't no man rides in here and tells me how to run justice. Not McKenna, not nobody. The girl swings at dawn, just like I said." But even his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before, a hardness covering something else. Doubt. In her cell, the young woman listened carefully. She had been half dreaming, drifting in and out of restless thoughts, but the moment the name was spoken, she froze. Colt McKenna. She had heard that name before. Everyone had. His stories reached far and wide, always dripping in blood and shadow. Her heart thudded in her chest. What business would a man like that have here, in a small town, hanging a woman no one cared about? Outside the jailhouse, the town was just as restless. Saloon doors hung open with no piano playing. Mothers whispered hurried prayers while shuddering. Their windows. Even the drunks stumbled home early, muttering about omens and the devil riding at night. By the time the church bell tolled midnight, the streets were deserted, save for a few lanterns burning low. The woman pressed her hands to the bars, straining to catch every word from the deputy's table. "You ever hear what he did in Santa?" "Fee?" Briggs said, voice low. "Walked into the sheriff's office same as this one. Said a prisoner was his, and when they wouldn't hand him over, 'Enough,' the sheriff snapped, his boots dropping to the floor. He stood, his broad frame casting a long shadow on the wall. You boys can scare yourselves with ghost stories all night, but dawn's coming fast. I don't care if the devil himself rides through that door, the girl hangs." The deputies went quiet, but the fear lingered in their eyes. The prisoner sank back against the wall, her pulse racing. Colt McKenna. Was it possible? Could he truly be coming here? And if he did, would it be for her, or would she simply be caught in the storm that followed him? For the first time that night, she didn't think only of the rope. She thought of the horizon, of the dark figure who might be cutting across it even now, his horse pounding the earth like a drum of war. A whisper of hope stirred in her chest, fragile as glass. Somewhere far beyond the town, thunder rolled, only it wasn't thunder. It was hooves. The hour crept past midnight, and the jailhouse air grew thick with unease. The sheriff paced the narrow room, his boots striking the boards with a rhythm that echoed louder than the clock on the wall. The deputies had grown restless, their card, game abandoned, their eyes darting toward the door every time the wind rattled it against its hinges. Sheriff Amos Cutter was not a man easily rattled. He had carried the badge for 20 years, and in that time he had faced cattle rustlers, bank robbers, and even a war party or two. But this was different. Colt McKenna was no ordinary outlaw. He was a storm that blew through towns and left them changed forever. Cutter knew it. His men knew it. The whole town knew it. He stopped pacing and planted his hands on the desk, leaning forward so the lamp glow sharpened the hard lines of his face. "Listen up," he said, his voice a low growl. "I don't want to hear McKenna's name again tonight. Man's flesh and blood same as us. Ain't no ghost, ain't no devil. But if he does come riding through that door, you boys best keep steady hands. You flinch, and it's your hide." Deputy Harlan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sheriff, with all respect, if half the tales about McKenna are true—" "They ain't," Cutter snapped, though the sharpness in his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. "Tales grow taller than trees out here. He's just a man with a fast hand, that's all." In the cell, the young woman pulled her knees to her chest, listening. The deputies might have been scared, but the sheriff was different. He was a wall of iron, unwilling to bend, unwilling to be moved. If Colt McKenna truly came, there would be blood. She felt it deep in her bones. Cutter turned from his men and walked back toward her cell. His spurs chimed faintly, a sound she was beginning to dread. He stopped just beyond the bars, his shadow looming large across the floor. "You hear the talk?" he asked her. She lifted her head slowly, wary of his tone. "I hear plenty," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment, then leaned in close enough that the lamp's light etched the lines around his eyes. "Don't go thinking some outlaw's gonna ride in here and save your neck. You're hanging at dawn. That's the way of it. Best accept it now." She stared back at him, her lips trembling, though she tried to steady them. "You're afraid," she said softly. The sheriff stiffened, his jaw tightening. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then his hand gripped the bars so hard his knuckles whitened. "I ain't afraid of no man," he growled. "And you'd do well not to put faith in shadows." He released the bars and stepped back, straightening his coat. At first light, preacher comes, rope drops, end of story. But even as he spoke, the words rang hollow. Deputy Briggs cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Sheriff, what if he claims her? What if he says she's his?" The sheriff turned slowly, his eyes like steel. "Then I remind him who runs this town. Bride or no bride, justice don't bow to gunmen." The words hung heavy in the air. The prisoner lowered her gaze, but inside her chest, her heart pounded, louder than before. Could it be true? Could a man feared by so many truly ride into this town, into her life, and call her his? And if he did, what would that mean? Freedom? Or another kind of prison altogether? Outside, the wind moaned through the empty street, carrying with it the scent of dust and rain. Far off, just at the edge of hearing, came the faintest drum, of hooves on hard earth. The sheriff froze. So did his men. No one spoke, but every man in that jailhouse knew the same thing. Dawn was coming, but so was something else, something far more dangerous. The night before, a hanging usually had its own rhythm in a frontier town. The saloon would be loud with whiskey and cards, the street full of men making bets on how long the condemned would last before the rope snapped their neck. Children, too young to understand but eager for spectacle, would whisper about sneaking out at sunrise to watch. Even the preacher would sit awake in his parlor, rehearsing words of salvation for the guilty. But this night was different. The town of redemption sat wrapped in silence, as if the earth itself held its breath. Lamps burned behind shuttered windows, their light spilling in thin cracks onto the dirt street. The saloon piano had gone quiet hours ago, its keys untouched. The church bell, which should have been tolling prayers, remained still. And though the gallows stood ready in the square, its rope coiled neatly, waiting, no one dared go near it. Everywhere, whispers followed a single name, Colt McKenna, the Black Rider. The outlaw with the dead man's eyes. Mothers hushed their children with it, as if even saying his name too loud might summon him to their door. Old men spat into the dust and muttered they'd rather see the devil himself than cross McKenna's path. At the livery, the stable boy swore he'd heard hooves out in the hills. In the saloon, the barkeep claimed a drifter had seen him a day's ride east, cutting down 2 bounty hunters like they were nothing more than flies. And in every corner of the town, the same fearful question spread. If McKenna comes, what will happen when he learns the woman swings at dawn? Inside her cell, the young woman pressed her ear against the cold stone wall, listening. Though the jail was quiet, she could feel the town's unrest humming through it like distant thunder. She had never been a woman of importance. Her life had been plain, her name barely worth a headline, and yet tonight, an entire town seemed to orbit around her fate. The sheriff's words echoed in her head. Bride or no bride, justice don't bow to gunmen. But what if justice had no choice? She closed her eyes and tried to imagine him, the gunslinger of 100 stories. Some said he was tall as a tree and rode a stallion blacker than midnight. Others said he carried 2 colts that had never missed their mark. She wondered which. Stories were lies and which were truth. Would he come to save her or claim her for something worse? Her heart beat faster at the thought. At the edge of town, the preacher sat alone in the church, his Bible open on his lap. His hands trembled as he read, though not from age. He knew his duty was to comfort the condemned, to offer words of peace, but his prayers kept stumbling over the same thought. If Colt McKenna rides in, Scripture may not save anyone come dawn. The boarding house, women clutched their children tight. In the saloon, men whispered of leaving before sunup, some already saddling their horses in the dark. Even the deputies sitting in the jailhouse traded uneasy glances. No one wanted to admit it, but fear hung over redemption heavier than the high noose rope swaying in the gallows. Near 2 in the morning, a sound carried through the streets. Faint, but unmistakable. The steady drum of hooves. Shutters closed tighter. Lamps blew out. Dogs whined and crawled beneath porches. The town seemed to fold in on itself, shrinking back into shadow, waiting. In her cell, the woman's eyes flew open. She pressed her face to the bars, straining to hear. Her chest rose and fell in quick breaths, hope and dread tangling in her veins. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the town limits, a lone rider cut across the hills, his silhouette framed by a sky full of stars. Dawn was still hours away, but for the people of redemption, it already felt like Judgment Day was coming. The hour was past 2 when the sound became clear. Not just the faint echo of hooves across the hills. This was closer now, sharp and steady, a heartbeat of iron against hard earth. The town of redemption seemed to shrink with each strike of the hooves, every clap rattling windows and tightening throats. Inside the jailhouse, the deputies froze mid-breath. Their cards lay forgotten, their whiskey untouched. Deputy Harlan's hand hovered near his revolver, though his fingers trembled too much to close around it. Deputy Briggs stood, spit in his tin, and muttered, "God help us." The sheriff said, "Nothing." He stood by the window, eyes narrowing at the street outside. The lamplight caught the scar on his jaw, a mark from an old gunfight, and for the first time in years, Sheriff Amos Cutter felt that scar burn. The hoofbeats grew louder, slower, deliberate. Whoever rode out there wasn't in a hurry. No, he was announcing himself. The young woman in the cell sat rigid on her bench, her hands gripping the chains at her wrists. She could feel it in her bones. This was no drunken ranch hand stumbling home, no wandering stranger. This was him. Colt McKenna. The sound stopped. Silence stretched across the town, heavy enough to smother. Then came the creak of leather, the faint jingle of spurs, and the soft thud of boots meeting dirt. A shadow moved in the street, tall and broad, the brim of a black hat low enough to hide the face beneath it. A stallion as dark as midnight stood behind him, steam rising from its flanks. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to turn the whole town into stone. The saloon doors quivered on their hinges. A dog barked once, and went silent. Somewhere, a woman sobbed behind closed shutters. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He adjusted his gun belt, squared his shoulders, and muttered, "So it's true." The front door of the jailhouse groaned as it swung open. The hinges squealed, though the man pushing it moved with quiet ease. He stepped inside, his boots ringing against the wood floor with slow, measured taps. The deputies reached for their guns, but the sheriff lifted a hand. "Don't." The outlaw stopped in the lamplight. He was tall, shoulders wide beneath a long, dusted coat. A black hat shadowed most of his face, but the lamplight caught the edge of his jaw, sharp as cut stone. 2 revolvers hung at his sides, worn but polished, like extensions of his hands. His eyes, when they lifted, were gray as steel, cold and unreadable. Colt McKenna. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to hold itself still. Then, in a voice low and smooth, the outlaw broke the silence. "I hear you got my bride locked up." The words fell heavy, shocking the deputies, even the sheriff. The young woman in the cell stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. "Bride?" The sheriff stepped forward, bristling. "She's no bride of yours, McKenna. She's a convicted criminal. At dawn she swings." McKenna tilted his head slightly, his gaze cutting toward the cell. The woman's eyes met his through the bars, and though fear clutched her heart, she felt something else too. An odd flicker of recognition, as if his face had lingered in some half-forgotten memory. He turned back to the sheriff, voice calm, but edged with steel. "At dawn, she leaves with me. That's the way of it." Deputy Briggs shifted, his hand brushing his gun. The outlaw's eyes flicked toward him, sharp as lightning, and Briggs froze. The sheriff didn't flinch, though. Sweat traced his temple. "You think you can ride in here, claim her, and walk out like the law don't matter?" McKenna's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Law?" His hand brushed the worn grip of his revolver. "Out here, law's just who's left standing." The air thickened, the standoff balanced on a knife's edge. The woman gripped the bars so hard her knuckles burned, her pulse racing as she realized the truth. Dawn would not bring justice. It would bring blood. The jailhouse air was tight as a noose. Colt McKenna stood in the middle of the room, shadow, stretching long in the lamplight, his revolvers resting easy at his sides. Sheriff Cutter faced him across the desk, jaw set, every muscle wound tight. The deputies hovered near the walls, their hands never straying too far from their holsters, though fear bled from every pore. And in the back cell, the condemned woman clung to the bars, her heart beating so loud she thought the whole town might hear it. She could not look away from the man in black. "I'll say it plain." McKenna's voice came, low and steady, like rolling thunder. "That woman in there is mine. She's my bride. And no rope in this town is going round her neck." The words cracked through the air like gunfire. The deputies exchanged nervous glances. Bride? They had heard many stories about Colt McKenna, but none had ever painted him as a man to take a wife. The outlaw's reputation was built on death, not devotion. The sheriff stepped forward, his spurs biting the floorboards. "Bride or not, she's under the law of redemption. The town's voted her guilty. At dawn, she hangs. You can't ride in here and change that with a few words." McKenna didn't blink. His gray eyes locked on the sheriff's with a weight that made even Cutter falter a step. "A few words?" His hand ghosted over the grip of his gun. "I've changed whole towns with less." The room froze. The deputies' breaths grew shallow, their eyes darting between the two men. They knew if a bullet flew, the fight would be over before they even cleared leather. The woman gripped the bars tighter. Her mind raced. Why was he doing this? Calling her his bride, staking his claim as if they shared a bond she could not remember. Was it a lie to save her, or something more? The sheriff's face darkened. He planted his boots firmly, refusing to back down. "You'd bring blood to this town over a woman you barely know? Don't fool me, McKenna. This ain't about her. This is about you proving you can take what you want." For the first time, McKenna's expression shifted, a flicker of something deeper cutting through the stone of his face. He turned his head slightly, speaking loud enough for all to hear. "She once saved me. Years back. She don't remember it, but I do. She gave me a drink when I was bleeding in the dirt, and that one mercy kept me alive. Now I aim to return the debt." The woman gasped, her mind scrambling through forgotten faces, broken nights, 100 small kindnesses she'd given without thought. Could it be true? The sheriff's jaw worked, but his eyes betrayed him. The weight of McKenna's words hung thick. The deputies shifted uneasily. What law could argue against a man honoring a life debt when his gun hand could write law faster than ink? McKenna stepped closer to the cell, his boots steady, his shadow falling across her face. He spoke softer now, but the words cut like steel. "You're mine, not the ropes, not the towns. Mine." The sheriff's hand twitched near his holster. "You're declaring war on redemption, McKenna." The outlaw turned, his coat sweeping like a dark wing. His voice was calm, deadly certain. "I don't declare war. I finish it." The silence that followed was worse than any gunshot. The woman pressed her forehead against the bars, her breath trembling. She didn't know whether to fear him, trust him, or both. But one truth burned through her chest. For the first time, since the gallows had been built, dawn no longer promised her death. It promised chaos. The silence inside the jailhouse was sharp enough to cut. The lamplight flickered across iron bars, sweating brows, and the gleam of Colt McKenna's revolvers. Deputy Briggs couldn't stand it any longer. His hand twitched at his side, fingers brushing the butt of his gun. His nerves were frayed raw. He had heard too many stories of McKenna killing men quicker than a rattler's strike. If he didn't move first, he reckoned, he might not move at all. "Don't," the sheriff barked, his voice quick, hard, but it was too late. Briggs yanked for his revolver. The outlaw's hand blurred, faster than sight. Steel flashed. The crack of a pistol tore the night wide open. When the smoke cleared, Briggs's gun lay shattered on the floor, kicked from his hand before he'd even aimed. His wrist bled from a grazing shot. He staggered back, clutching it, his face pale with shock. McKenna hadn't moved from where he stood. His revolver was already holstered again, as if it had never left. Only the faint curl of smoke from the barrel betrayed the speed of his hand. The woman in the cell sucked in a sharp breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had seen death before, but never like this. Death restrained, death held back by a man who clearly could have taken it if he'd wished. The other deputy, Harlan, froze with his hand halfway to his belt. He looked from Briggs to McKenna and slowly raised both palms. "Sweet Lord." The sheriff stood as stone, but his eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, McKenna. You spill blood in here, this town won't forgive it." McKenna's gaze cut to him, gray and cold. "I didn't spill blood. I spared it." His tone was calm, but the weight behind it made the deputies shiver. He had proved his point without killing. The message was clear. If he wanted them dead, they would already be on the floor. McKenna turned, walking slowly toward the woman's cell. His boots rang steady, each step measured. He rested one hand against the bars, his face still cloaked beneath the brim of his hat. "She's leaving with me," he said. "I'll walk her out at dawn, and if any man tries to stop me—" His hand drifted to his revolver again, light as a whisper. "I won't miss next time." The sheriff clenched his jaw. His pride boiled. He had spent 2 decades keeping order in redemption, and now one man dared to undo it all. But in his gut, he knew the truth. If McKenna wanted to, he could cut down the whole jailhouse before a single bullet touched him. Still, Sheriff Cutter was not a man to bow. "She's under my law," he said, voice low. "And if you aim to break her free, you'll have to shoot your way through me." McKenna's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Then you'd best draw quick, Sheriff." The room trembled on a razor's edge. The deputies held their breath, their hands frozen halfway between fear and duty. The woman gripped the bars, her nails biting into her skin, her throat raw with the scream she dared not let loose. The outlaw and the lawman stood locked in silence, the air heavy with the promise of gunfire. At last, McKenna broke it, his voice quiet, but carrying more weight than any bullet. "You've got till dawn to think on it." He stepped back, folding his arms across his chest, as if he had already decided the fight wasn't worth spilling blood just yet. His confidence was unnerving, unshakable. He spoke as though the outcome were already written, and perhaps it was. The sheriff turned sharply, barking to his deputies, "Hold your posts. Nobody draws unless I say." His words were steady, but his hands trembled when he lit his pipe. In her cell, the woman's pulse still raced, but for the first time since her arrest, the iron taste of fear was joined by something else. Hope. Terrifying, dangerous hope. The jailhouse was quieter now, though the silence was no less heavy. Deputy Briggs sat in the corner, his wrist bandaged and his pride wounded more than his flesh. Deputy Harlan lingered by the desk, wide-eyed, his hand nowhere. Near his holster this time, Sheriff Cutter puffed his pipe in the corner, smoke curling like storm clouds, his jaw locked tight. And in the middle of it all, Colt McKenna leaned against the bars of her cell, his broad shoulders filling the lamplight, his gray eyes fixed. on the woman he had just claimed as his bride. She sat on the bench, wrists chained, her dark hair loose around her face. She tried to keep her gaze steady, but the weight of his eyes was like fire on her skin. Finally, she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why?" McKenna tilted his head slightly, as though surprised she had asked. "Why what?" Her throat tightened. "Why would you do this? Why come here, risk your life? For me? We've never met." For a moment, silence stretched. His jaw worked, his hand brushing the edge of his coat. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping low, meant for her ears alone. "You did once." Her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" His eyes searched hers, unblinking, steady as stone. 5 years back, outside Santa Fe. I was bleeding bad. Caught a bullet from a bounty man. I crawled into the dust, thought I was finished. But a girl came along. She gave me water. Stayed with me long enough to keep the buzzards off. Didn't even ask who I was. Didn't care if I was outlaw or saint. She just saved me. Her breath caught. Faint scraps of memory stirred. An image of a man collapsed in the dirt, his shirt soaked red, his eyes half-lidded with death. She remembered kneeling beside him, holding a canteen to his lips, whispering, "Don't quit now." She hadn't known who he was, hadn't stayed to learn. She'd been running herself, desperate and nameless. Her eyes widened. "That was you?" McKenna nodded once. "That was me. I owed you my life, and I pay my debts." Her chest rose and fell with quick breaths. She wanted to laugh, to deny it, but the truth sat heavy in her bones. She had done that once, a foolish kindness in the middle of her own running. She had never expected it to matter, never expected it to return like this. "You risked all this," she whispered, "for a debt?" His eyes hardened, the steel in them glinting. "I don't leave debts unpaid, not to anyone, least of all you." Something twisted in her chest. Fear, yes, but also a strange warmth. For the first time since her arrest, she felt seen, remembered. She had been nothing but a shadow to this town, a guilty name whispered in saloons. But to him, she had been salvation. Still, doubt gnawed at her. "You called me your bride," she said, voice trembling. "Why?" "You didn't have to," McKenna cut her off, his voice steady, resolute. "It was the only way. Sheriff here don't bend for mercy, but men fear what they can't own, and nobody dares touch a woman who wears my name. The rope might claim a stranger, but it won't claim my bride." The word bride hung between them like thunder. Her lips parted, but no words came. She didn't know whether to curse him or thank him. He had given her a shield, but it was one forged in blood and fear. To wear his name was to inherit his enemies, his shadow, his legend, and yet it meant life. From across the room, the sheriff's voice cut through the silence. "You think claiming her changes anything? She's guilty. Tomorrow she hangs." McKenna's eyes never left hers as he answered, quiet but sharp as a blade. "Tomorrow, Sheriff, she rides with me." Her heart hammered in her chest. She had begged for a miracle, for any hand to pull her from the gallows, and now it had come. Only it wasn't a preacher's mercy or a jury's pardon. It was Colt McKenna, the deadliest man in the West, and she was his bride. The jailhouse clock ticked slow through the night, each heavy thud marking the last moments before dawn. Outside, the town of Redemption stirred uneasy. Doors shut tighter than usual, lamps burning low, as though every soul knew trouble was about to come walking down Main Street. Inside, the woman hadn't slept. She sat against the bars, wrists still chained, her eyes fixed on the outlaw who had claimed her life as his own. Colt McKenna had not moved much either. He leaned in the corner, hat tipped low, arms crossed. He looked like a man at rest, but every breath of him was coiled steel. When the first pale streak of light cut across the horizon, the sheriff rose from his chair, pipe cold, jaw set like stone. "It's dawn," Sheriff Cutter said. "Time's up." McKenna straightened slowly, pushing off the wall. He adjusted his hat, his shadow stretching long in the lamplight. "Then let's walk." The sheriff's lips curled. "You won't make it 20 paces." McKenna didn't answer. He turned instead to her, stepping close to the bars. His hand reached through, brushing the lock that held her chains. With a flick of steel, quick, sure, his knife slid the shackle open. The irons clattered to the floor and she rubbed her wrists, skin raw but free. He offered his hand. "Come." Her breath trembled as she took it. His grip was warm, steady, like iron wrapped in flesh. For the first time since the noose had been tied, she believed she might see another sunrise. McKenna pushed the cell open, guiding her out. Every deputy's hand twitched toward a holster, but the sheriff's glare froze them still. No man wanted to be the first to fall. They stepped out of the jailhouse into the crisp blue light of dawn. The street lay silent, but not empty. Men lingered on porches, rifles cradled across their chests. Women peered from behind curtains, clutching children close. A hush had fallen over Redemption, the hush of a town holding its breath. At the end of the street, 2 horses waited. One was black as midnight, McKenna's own. The other, a chestnut mare, saddled, reins loose, as though waiting just for her. The sheriff followed them onto the boardwalk, voice booming to the crowd. "This woman's under the law. Colt McKenna aims to steal her from justice. You stand aside, you're traitors to redemption." But no man moved. No gun was raised. Every face turned toward the outlaw instead, waiting, watching. McKenna's voice carried like thunder, low and certain. "This woman is mine, and I'll kill any man who says different." For a heartbeat, the air split with silence. Then a shot cracked the dawn. A bullet kicked dust at McKenna's boot. On the rooftop across the street, a rifleman leveled his sights. McKenna moved like lightning. His revolver cleared leather, barking flame. The rifleman toppled backward, rifle clattering to the shingles. Chaos erupted, shouts, curses, boots pounding across the boardwalk. But McKenna's presence cut through it all. He swept his revolver wide, each shot placed like a masterstroke, driving men back, scattering rifles from hands. "Run!" he barked to her. Her skirts tangled, her lungs burned, but she ran, boots striking the boards, heart hammering in her throat. The chestnut mare stamped and snorted, eyes wide with the scent of gunpowder. She fumbled at the reins, but McKenna was already there, swinging into the saddle of his black stallion. With one arm, he pulled her up behind him. Bullets screamed through the dawn. Windows shattered, dust rose. The sheriff bellowed for his men to fire, but none could draw fast enough. McKenna wheeled his horse, spurring hard, and the black stallion surged forward like a thunderbolt. The mare followed, her reins tangled in his grip, dragged along in their flight. The crowd scattered as the outlaw and the condemned woman thundered. Down Main Street, gunfire chasing their heels, the noose left swaying empty in the morning light. And as they broke beyond the edge of town, the rising sun spilled gold across the desert hills. She clung to him, half in terror, half in desperate relief. The wind tore her hair loose, her chains left behind in the dust. For the first time, she was not running toward death. She was riding into life, wild, dangerous, uncertain, but alive. The desert swallowed redemption behind them, the town shrinking to a smudge in the morning haze. Hooves pounded hard across the earth, carrying them into wild country where lawmen feared to chase too far. Still, she clung tight to Colt McKenna's back, every jolt rattling her bones, her cheek pressed against the coarse fabric of his coat. Her wrists stung where the shackles had rubbed, and her lungs ached from the gallop. But beneath the terror, a strange calm settled over her. The rope was no longer waiting. She was breathing. She was alive. When the horses finally slowed, McKenna reined them into a canyon carved deep by time and storms. She slid from the saddle, knees weak, breath ragged. He dismounted beside her, scanning the ridgelines with a hunter's eye, revolver loose in his hand. No riders followed, not yet. She pressed a hand to her chest, her heart still hammering. "We can't outrun them forever." McKenna looked at her, his gray eyes steady, unreadable. "We don't need forever, just enough," her brow furrowed. "Enough for what?" "For you to start again." The words struck her like a blow. She searched his face, but his expression gave nothing away. "You risked all this, for me to walk free? You don't even know my name." McKenna holstered his revolver, turning slightly away. "Names don't matter. What you did once, that mattered." Memories of that day by the Santa Fe Trail flickered in her mind, kneeling in the dirt, pressing a canteen to a dying man's lips. She had thought it nothing, a fleeting kindness, quickly forgotten. But to him, it had grown into a debt that spanned years, a chain stronger than iron. "I never thought—" Her voice faltered. "I never thought anyone would come for me." He looked at her then, something raw breaking through the steel in his gaze. "I told you before, I pay my debts. But maybe this ain't just that anymore." The canyon wind whistled low. She felt the words settle heavy between them, more dangerous than any bullet. Her throat tightened. "You called me your bride." He nodded once. "And I meant it." She stared at him, torn between fear and something dangerously close to longing. To bind herself to Colt McKenna was to tie her fate to a storm, to walk a path lined with blood and fire. But to refuse him was to step back into the hangman's shadow, into chains and death. Her voice shook. "Do I even get a choice?" McKenna stepped closer, his hand brushing the rough skin of her wrist where the shackles had been. "You do, more than the law ever gave you, more than that noose would have allowed. You want to ride on? I'll give you a horse, point you toward the horizon. You'll vanish into it and no one will follow." Her breath caught. He wasn't chaining her. He was handing her freedom. And yet, her heart twisted at the thought of riding away from him, of never again feeling the steady strength of his presence. She whispered, "And if I stay?" His voice dropped, deep and certain. "Then you ride with me. Not as a debt, not as a bargain. As my wife. Through fire, through blood. Whatever comes." The silence that followed was louder than gunfire. Her gaze lifted to the ridgeline, where the sun spilled fire across the desert. She thought of the gallows she'd left swaying empty, of the life she'd already lost. Then she looked back to the outlaw before her, the man who had turned the world on its head to drag her from death. Slowly, she stepped closer. Her fingers curled into his coat, her voice steady now. "Then I stay." McKenna's jaw tightened, but for the first time, the hard edge in his eyes softened. He reached for her, pulling her into the circle of his arms, his shadow folding around her like a shield. Above them, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last chill of dawn. Behind them lay the noose, the law, the town that had marked her for death. Ahead of them stretched only wilderness, blood and fire, and the beginning of something fierce, dangerous, and unbreakable. Together, outlaw and condemned woman rode into it, not toward survival, toward a future written in blood and in love.